Smoak.
So Jamie Pollard, the AD at Iowa State, was talking to some local media, and one of the potential of something separating when it comes to college football is the possibility that everyone, okay, if you're a part of the SEC or you're part of the Big Ten, you're protected. But are you? You would think that at some point, if it continues to get where the big eat everybody, that there are some in those two conferences that are not big that might be left behind. Now, that's one thing I've always loved about the SEC, and I guess the Big Ten too, is they have protected everybody. Whether you're a private school or a smaller school, they have always had your back, and they've always been as strong as the weakest link, depending on what you would consider that. Jamie Pollard of Iowa State was asked about the future of college athletics. Listen to what he says, and then we'll come back, get your feedback in the chat. Craig and Paul, and I will also, and Garrett, have our opinions too. It's about a minute, 30 seconds.
You just have to look at the evolution. It isn't the SEC and Big Ten. You just have to look at the evolution. It isn't the SEC and Big Ten. It's those that have all the gold make all the rules, right? So if I was a member of the Big Ten or the SEC, I'd start looking over my shoulder and wondering if when's the day going to come when the top of the SEC is not going to want the bottom of the SEC. I mean, go back and look at times when the AFL and the NFL merged, they only needed one commissioner. And when the ABA and the NBA merged, they only needed one commissioner. There's going to come a day they don't need two $6 million a year commissioners, and they're going to eat their own. And if we think that's not going to happen, you're a fool, because we didn't think the Pac-12 would get eaten, and it did. And the CFP is just another example of our industry running amok, and they're trying to swallow the ACC and the Big 12. And I wish them all the best, because they're going to eat their own.
So you think the Big Ten and SEC do not exist separately at some point? Is that what you're saying, I guess, in terms of how you phrase it with the commissioners? I'm
just saying from an evolution standpoint, if you'd asked me 2 years ago, is the Pac-12 going to be existent in 2025? I think all of us would have said yes. So you don't have to look back very far to see what's happened, and you can see what's happening. And so it's reasonable to project into the future and say, why wouldn't you think that will just continue, that those with the gold will make the rules?
All right, that's from Jamie Pollard. He was on a Cyclone Tailgate Tour event in West Des Moines, and a lot of the media that was there to cover that and what he was saying, there was a lot said there. And I've always felt that way, that even if you are in a conference right now that has your back, if it continues to get big enough, and some of the schools that were not a part of the SEC before that also will eat their own as it gets bigger and bigger, then there's a chance that maybe you get left behind at the next level. Maybe not the actually next step, but at some point down the road.
Well, the question has to remain, like, if it's about building the best television broadcast that you can build, and what the SEC has tried to do is every week almost is going to be, they want to have brand versus brand every week, brand versus brand multiple times a week. And there are some schools in the SEC that we know are not that way. There's even more in the Big Ten that are not that way. Of the 18 schools in the six, so of those 34 schools, less than half of them overall are as big a deal as some schools that are outside of that. And so, again, especially if you see what happens with the ACC, if there are bigger brands to take and they decide to do that, like, when down the line does it get to the point where, like, Vanderbilt, you're not helping us out any? Like, especially since this isn't about, the specter that it was about, like, pairing up academic things is kind of over now. I mean, because clearly, if it was about that, then Stanford and Cal would be able to just say, we'd like to be in the SEC. And then, like, all right, well, I guess we got to take you because of the books and all. Yeah. That's not how it is. So if it's about television and people watching more television stuff, what would you rather see? Would you rather see Ohio State play Clemson, or would you rather see Ohio State play Indiana?
I mean, that's the thing, though, is
And that's not necessarily people. That's the television executives who make these calls.
Yeah, but I will say on that part, like Indiana is what? It's the Indianapolis market, and Vanderbilt's Nashville, and it's Northwestern's Chicago, and Rutgers is New York, New Jersey. And so that's why they even have the weight that they do to begin with. So do you go and eliminate those markets? Like, I mean, do you willingly take them out because you just feel like you're going to have them? You know what I mean, though? Like, there's a reason why they have some cachet. But, I think he's spot on, though. I mean, like I said earlier, I think if you're talking about – if you're doing Champions League, then there's no need to all this cutting. And there's plenty of teams from various conferences that you could have that are still a part of it. It's a wide swath of teams. But if you're talking about being the Premier League, like some people fast forward to, then I'll go ahead and go down the list right now. Illinois, you're out. Indiana, see ya. Iowa, gone. Maryland, peace. Michigan State, probably not there. Minnesota, no. Northwestern, no chance. Purdue, not a chance. Rutgers, see ya. I mean, that you could easily do that. SEC, Arkansas, no. Kentucky, no. Mississippi State, no. South Carolina, no. Vanderbilt, no. And we can get more into the weeds and actually debate on like some of those others as well. And I'm sure before we get to this, I'm just talking about football, okay? I'm just talking about if you want to do like real deal Premier League, American college football, like you could toss away 8 to 10 teams that I just mentioned there. And then you get into like basically the top 20 all-time winningest teams. Now that would be some really interesting stuff. But I'm not as interested in, like, it's just the Big Ten and the SEC pretend that they're the NFL. I don't have as much interest in that. Now, if you want to take, like, the top 20 and you say, like, this is the elite of the elite and you want to match them up on a Saturday or every single Saturday, then I think you're onto something. But if you're still just feeding me, like, Texas versus Vandy and acting like it's some super league, well, I'm going to call BS on that, right? Because that's not what that is. Now, if you've earned your way into that, that's one thing. But if you're just grandfathered in, that's something else entirely. So I don't think the Premier League comparisons of what we're going for are exact. And I also don't think that's what it has to be. It can be just these two leagues feel like because they've got all the money and the biggest markets and they've scooped up everybody that's worth scooping up or will have done that in the next 2 to 3 years, that they feel like a 50-team or 60-team or whatever type league is going to be, the solution. But I do think that there is more cutting of the fat that will occur. I don't know if it'll get all the way down to the bone where, like I mentioned, where it's like the 20 elite teams. But I do think that, there's going to be some teams that just don't really belong in the grand scheme of things, that maybe were grandfathered in or marketed in or whatever. The commissioner one's great. There's not an AFC commissioner and an NFC commissioner. So with that example, that would seem to ring true as well. That, even if you're safe right now, seemingly, you might not be in 2 to 3 years. But there's so many, like I just laid out, there's so many directions it can still go. And nobody knows what direction except for probably the folks who are orchestrating it behind the scenes, much like they've orchestrated a lot of these other moves. And whether that's TV executives or Greg Sankey or Petiti or whoever you want to point to, I mean, I guess they're really the only people that have a real clue of what we're headed towards. And I bet they're having a lot of fun just watching us, like,
twisting the wind.
Just
not us, but schools.
Well, and us too, of just like wondering what the hell's going on. When I think of the soccer comparison, I'm saying you got to cut like half the teams that are even in those two leagues or close to it to get to really what that would look like. So I don't know if that's really feasible because that's a lot of teams you're leaving out in the cold. But you're also doing that even if you're just doing the two leagues. So, man, it's a mystery as to what this all looks like on the other side of it, and I'm fascinated by it. I'm also leery of it, but
for those schools that say no, we're protected, ask Oregon State, Washington State what it's like right now, because they were a part of an alpha conference with some great universities. Justin R., as someone on the outside looking in, I could see the SEC and the Big Ten switching sometime in the future to a performance-based system like the ACC wants. Paul, is that in effect now?
I think so. I think
so they're in a performance-based system?
Well, they're more almost like it's not performance-based. Like everybody's going to get the same except for like if you do better, you're going to get more of a cut of the postseason stuff.
Okay, so, well, that to me, that's fair.
Yeah.
Instead of everything being split.
I also think, too, like there's different conversations going on. Like there's the one that includes basketball, and then there's the one that's just football only. Yeah. And they're very different things because Kentucky's not getting in on football merits alone.
Yeah.
But they would in basketball. You know, like, so that's one of those where, you know, it's not quite clear really any direction of exactly where this all goes ultimately and what the final product looks like. But yeah, I think that's also a different conversation.
I think the simplest thing to do is eventually it's going to be, because especially the way that this, settlement and all these things will go and the way they'll have to tier out sports. I don't think they're going to be too long for these cross-country trips for the non-revenue sports. I think those are that's probably going to get resolved a lot faster than we even realize. And, especially with football, if football breaks off and then, you probably keep the football and basketball conferences the same just for, your continuity, but then everything else goes back to being regional. So then you get to the point of like, all right, then it starts getting down to, well, what do we really want this to be? Separate football and all this, and who's really in this deal? And is there a tier off where we just tell the group of five, like, listen, you had your nice little 5-6 years of doing this, but you're really kind of bothering us now, and we'd like you to go.
Somebody said that if they're going to eat each other, Sankey would win that over Petiti. I don't know. I'm not sure what kind of athlete
Well, I don't
Petiti
think,
might
look,
be.
here's the difference. I don't think Tony Petiti, because he's a television network exec, is necessarily in this for the long haul. I think he's someone who, like, if he, made his bones, boosted out after a few years.
You mean he's not long-term like Kevin Warren?
I think he's longer than Kevin
that was a
Warren,
joke.
but yeah, I think he's obviously
Hasn't
longer
he already
than Kevin.
lasted longer than Kevin Warren, I think?
So, like, he's longer than Kevin Warren, but Greg Sankey, this is the business he's chosen. And I'm using that quote from The Godfather for a reason, in that, like, you will pry him out of college athletics by his, with his cold, dead hands, So that's why I think that he would win out over everybody, because he's Greg Sankey, and that's what he's in. He's one of the last ones that's truly in the business of college athletics. Brett Yormark is new to the business of college athletics. Tony Petiti, new to the business of college athletics. Heck, the new AD at Notre Dame is a TV exec who's a Notre Dame alum, but new to college athletics. The last two are Greg Sankey, who has power, and Jim Phillips, who has a job.
And Yormark was not a part of college athletics, although he was a part of college
yeah.
promotion. Paxton, isn't the Super Conference the best team, so it shouldn't be surprising the bottom teams wouldn't be in it? One thing, I've said this again, the SEC and the Big Ten. Go ahead.
Well, no, because it depends on what like that. That's again what I was trying to say about how there's like different arguments ongoing. Like there's this idea that when you mention Super League, like people have different interpretations of that. Some people think it's just the Big Ten and the SEC getting together, and that's a Super League. I disagree. I don't think that's a Super League, because I think there's a bunch of Cleveland Browns, like the Cleveland Browns I grew up with. I think there's a bunch of Cleveland Browns in that league, and I don't think that they're Super League teams. But in some people's eyes, that's the Super League, is those two conferences. And then some people, I guess probably the same people, it's those two, and then it's like Florida State, and it's Clemson, and it's, North Carolina, whatever. It's like the other ACC leftovers. And then for some people, like Kansas gets in, and so again, it depends on where you look. But to me, if you're trying to do like a true Premier League, then yeah, you're cutting some fat from both the Big Ten and the SEC too. And you're going to have like 20 to 24 teams. I would be fascinated to watch that. I don't know if that's what are in the plans though, for whoever is in charge of is trying to pull off right now. That's what I mean, is like it's hard to speak in absolutes about anything, because we don't really know what the end goal is of anybody. We know it's a separation of some sort, but we don't know exactly what type of separation. Is the goal to end up with the top 20 biggest brands all playing each other, or the top 30, or is it to have 60, or is it to have, we don't know that, and so it's hard to really peg that. But yeah, to me, the elite's the elite, and the elite's not just because you happen to be in a conference. But that's just me, though.
Well, it'll be interesting to hear what Tim Brando has to say about it. We've already kind of heard his thoughts about it. Here's Justin R. As far as the non-revenue sports, you could change the schedules, right? For example, Rutgers at USC, you fly all fall teams out there over 4 days. You play all sports.
Well, that's what they're going to do already. I'm just telling you that's not going to last very long, because they're going to get sick of that. Mostly because it's tiring, and secondarily because they're not used to it, and they never will be. And the SEC will also roll through seasons of where the longest road trip in conferences, from from Gainesville to Lexington, and they'll be like, well, we missed that. We missed that right there. And we're not making money on it anyway. We're starting to take money out of especially the Big Ten. You're going to start taking money out of the big money you're making from football that, is going to have to go to these other things more so because travel is going to be more expensive. And they'll just go back to where it matters. And also, nobody's going to care about Rutgers versus USC softball. But the USC softball fans might care about USC versus Cal in softball. Like that's a niche sport, so the niche will be that. But I was going to say, I really do believe this about Florida State and Clemson. The way that they're approaching this thing with the ACC is they're totally fine that Florida makes more money than them and that Bama makes more money than them. They want to make that same money. What bothers them more, because they feel they're on that level, is that Rutgers and Vanderbilt and all these other schools do, so they want to find a way out so they can get Rutgers money. Like, that bothers them a lot more than the fact that the SEC and Big Ten have made these deals. It bothers them that there's teams in there that are not them. That are well below them historically.
Based on being grandfathered in, or back in 1918, the conferences were put together.
In Rutgers' case, being in a market. They're very lucky to be in a market that was desirable.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, and again, Florida State and Clemson are never going to say that part out loud because it doesn't really help their case overall. But believe me, that chaps their ass way more than the fact that, they're worried that those schools that are good are going to pass them. That's certainly worry. I think that
separate.
Separate. Yeah, like they're not going to be able to close the gap. But it upsets them that they're not allowed to close the gap because of a long TV deal and the fact that there's teams in there that have closed the gap that are not going to try to. Over time, with all this influx of money, is Northwestern really going to try to be that good of a team, or are they really going to put the resources there? Or
they're building a new stadium.
Well, yeah, but I mean, are they going to do it? Do they care as much at Northwestern
somebody asked this question
as somebody in Clemson? Yeah.
What about the teams that are struggling on the bottom part of each of those conferences? Does that bother them? I would think losing anything you do in life would bother you. But then when you get a check for that kind of money at the end of the year, then you're probably okay with it.
Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
They sign up every year to basically just get kicked around. And they have hopes that they're going to be better than that. They've made hires to be better than that and to improve, and they're not competing. But I think every year when the season starts up, we kind of know where you're going to find them at the end of it every single year. But that's okay because they're trying, and also they get a buttload of money to be Vanderbilt and to end up wherever they end up, and there's really no repercussions for being the bottom dweller every single year. But the checks are great, so, yeah, they seem to be okay with it. I would think that would chap the backside of certain athletic directors and prize school presidents, and maybe that's just kind of like a timing thing where sometimes there's schools that care more about that at a certain period of time because of leadership versus others. But, I think I hate to just always pick on Vanderbilt, but it's like one of these things is not like the other. And so, yeah, that's one that I think if you're Florida State or Oklahoma State or Oregon State, you look at them and you're like, damn, man, like how just lucky are they and to be where they're located and to have the history they had. But, man, we are trying way harder than they are with much less to be relevant and have been more relevant. But we just weren't lucky enough to be in Nashville, Tennessee, decades ago when a lot of this was being formed up. And so, yeah, I think that chaps people, but to answer your question, I think that, yeah, if you're any of those teams that ends up at the bottom, you don't want to be a perennial loser, but if you're Northwestern and it's allowing you to build a stadium on the lake because you're getting a cajillion dollars every year just by being a member of the Big Ten, then that's a nice trade-off for
Vanderbilt
losing.
was accepted into the SEC back in 1933. And this, by the way, that's a great school. They didn't offer me, and I couldn't have gone there. They have a great baseball tradition. They've got other traditions that are outside of this is all basically about football. They have been to 9 bowl games in over 100 years.
Yeah.
And have made $100 million more than anybody in the Big 12 who's won a title here recently, except for Texas and Oklahoma.
This is not blasting Vanderbilt. This is about reality of why there's frustration, whether it's FSU or Oklahoma State or Texas Tech or whoever else.
Well, and ask Oklahoma State what they were in 1933. Right? It's a different thing. So, Ask Florida State was a girls' school.
They were Oklahoma A&M.
Yeah. Florida State was a girls' school. So it's so many things have
should
changed.
Vanderbilt take heat for that? We're not giving Vanderbilt heat. What we're trying to do is look at things.
I think the overall perspective is fair to go, well, why is this the way it is because of something that happened in 1933? Not Vanderbilt's fault.
Yeah, because if we're changing conferences and rivalries and all of that, why can't you also then change who was accepted when?
Well, and look, this is, and not to get like historical and boring, but this is kind of an American thing. Like we did something that was made sense at the time. I'll give you the example of tipping. So tipping doesn't really happen a lot around the world because they pay waiters and restaurant staffs like normal wages.
You know who knows that?
What?
Indomitian Sue brought this up on Twitter the other day.
So they do that. Why do we have tipping here? Well, because in the Depression, when people, business owners were kind of strapped and all these different things, they said, you can come here and work for tips. And it was mutually beneficial to, a time when restaurant owners and people who needed jobs, were just trying to make a deal and get by with whatever they could find. And you didn't have to pay them a salary. And then when we got out of the Great Depression, restaurant owners are like, well, I kind of like this deal here. And then it just got grandfathered in for so long that now that they're like the industry that can pay below a minimum wage and be like, well, I guess you suck at waiting tables,
Yeah.